This is the Senate Education Committee, a little bit after 3:15 on January 30th. And this afternoon, for this section of our afternoon, we have people from JFO to walk us through just the existing system of education finance in Vermont. We have Julia and Ezra, and I think, and John is here as well. So off we go. Floor is yours. We have, by the way, people, we have, this is coming to us in hard copy sometime over the course of this next few minutes. So you can pull it up on your screens. Oh, right there.
All right, well, as the chair.
For the record.
Yes, for the record, I am Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office.
And I'm Julia Richter, JM.
All right, and I guess we'll just get started.
Yeah.
So today we're going to just do a very high level, as the chairman said, overview of the current structure of Vermont's education finance. So we'll take a look at the overview, the education expenditures, as well as the education funding, and how that comes in through non-property taxes, non-homestead property taxes, and homestead property taxes as well. So a quick introduction, and this may not be new to any of you, but Vermont's education system is different from other states. And that's because there's a statewide funding formula, but there is a large degree of local control and locally set budgets. And so that district spending is determined at the local level based on budgets that the local voters approve, but then the state as a whole will fund it. And that is due to the Brigham decision in 1997, which was designed to make the system more equitable to districts that had a lower grand list value versus districts that had a lot of property and therefore had advantages when funding their budgets. And so after this decision, the district rates were no longer tied to that property wealth, and the tax rates are instead proportion of per pupil spending. So that way, every district can spend the same regardless of their property their property value. And so, as I mentioned, so just brief history here. Prior to 1997, there actually was a foundation formula in Vermont, and it's a different foundation formula than the one that you heard about a few minutes ago from the agency. And so foundation formula broadly relies on a flat or base level of funding from the state, and then state aid is provided to districts that aren't able to raise the full foundation amount, but due to fluctuations in the state's fiscal status, the state was not able to maintain the funding, which then passed the burden onto the districts. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is that, if you were in a school district with a low property value, that was a much higher burden on you relative to other towns that had maybe a lot of property value. So they were able to handle that burden a lot more easily. So that led to the passage of Act 60 in 1997. And well, here we are today. So under Act 60, towns with the same per pupil spending have the same education tax rate, regardless of how much property value they have within the district. And so the current education finance timeline is that school boards will begin preparing the district-wide budget. And then on December 1, the Commissioner of Taxes, in cooperation with Joint Fiscal Office, us, we work on the December 1 letter. And once we reach consensus, the tax department will publish that letter. And the December 1 letter essentially is setting the tax rates at a uniform level, which I mean property that's homestead and then also non-homestead. So we set a uniform change there. And so that forecasts the next fiscal year rates on December 1. And that's the starting place. Those rates can then fluctuate throughout the session based on the decisions of the legislative body. And so the school boards will continue to prepare their district budget with that December 1 letter in mind and prepare the budgets for their voters to look at. And then in March, usually at town meeting day, the members of those school districts will go and vote on the budgets, either approving them or not approving them. And then the schools will need to go back and prepare another budget to try and get passed. And so the General Assembly sets property taxes at the level estimated necessary to fund all voter-approved school budgets via the yield bill. And again, so, the interesting thing about Vermont is that all of these local decisions are coming together, and then the state needs to find a way to respond and to fund it all fully. And so it's an interesting system. And so on or before June 30th, you have the Department of Taxes sets the rate, and that's because of the yield bill, because of all of the budgets from March. And then either in late summer or early fall, the towns will then administer the education property taxes, and the taxpayers will pay their property taxes. The districts will start out the new school year with these budgets, and then you start the process all over again.
Yeah, questions about, yeah.
If I could. So currently, the school boards and such are setting up for the 2025, 2026 budget cycle.
Six.
26.
26.
Just 26, so calendar year 26.
Fiscal year. We're in,
So-
we're in 25 right now.
This year,
Yeah.
six.
Okay, so it's 2025,
I
2026.
was waiting for them to answer.
So yes, so two different calendars, right? So preparing for the states, so the fiscal year 2026 is what's being forecasted right now in the December 1 letter that was released December of 2024. But for a school calendar, it would read 25, 26, starting in October of 2025 going through. So two different calendars going on it. It does get confusing, lots of different overlapping calendars, but yes.
Okay, so what fiscal year does the current AOE proposal affect? Is it 2 years out from now? So everything we're talking about doesn't touch the current budget conversations, or this year or next year, this time.
Right, so I would have to defer to the agency's timeline on rolling out, but we are currently in fiscal year 2025, and the December 1 letter is for 2026, assuming no change to the structure at all.
Okay, very good.
So incidentally, for people watching at home, these slides are now posted. They just went up. So people at home, if you are watching, you might want to back out and then come back in, and you'll get it's up under Ezra's name. So.
All right, and so education expenditures. So education expenditures, like I mentioned, each school district builds their own budget. That's because in Vermont, there's a large degree of local control. So each district is building their own budget. And from a financial perspective, budgets have two parts: the offsetting revenues and the education spending. So your local school districts offsetting revenues would be anything that they receive that goes in and would either reduce or increase the education spending. So state and federal categorical aid, tuition revenues to the school district, prior year surplus or deficit of the school district, and then any reserve fund. So after accounting for all of those, either at additions or subtractions in the case of a potential deficit, you then have the education spending for the school district. And so then you have the state level, because it's a statewide system. So now we have the local pieces. You zoom out to the statewide expenditure. And so that is the aggregated costs of public education, including the school budgets. And that would be net of the offsetting revenues, because that was accounted for in the district's education spending, and other expenditures lumped into the state level education expenditures include categorical aid, one-time appropriations, and other operating or administrative costs at the state level. And so, yeah, it's a little difficult to see on the screen here, but thankfully you all do have some handouts, should be a little easier. This is the Education Fund Outlook, and you can also see it in much better quality on the JFO website. You know, you have the entire web page to view it instead of trying to put it on a small slide here for you all. But I have circled and then blown out here the appropriations section of the Education Fund Outlook, and those are the I guess you could say the expenditures of the Ed Fund. So you have the education payment there on line 11 that we just touched on, is that aggregation of all of the local school budgets. And then you have special education, state place students, transportation aid, all of these categorical aids through there as well. And then it also includes any one-time costs or other miscellaneous expenditures as well. And so education payment, the aggregated total cost of those school budgets is about 80% of this appropriation right here. And you can see on line 26 that it is currently listed at 2.3 billion for the fiscal year 2025 there on line 26 there. And again, this, if you want to have a much I guess, better view of this, I would really encourage you to go to the Joint Fiscal Office website, and we have the Outlook as well as an annotated guide, which has little descriptions of every single line, and that can really guide you through when you're trying to read this. And so on the other side, we have the education funding, you know, the money coming in to pay for those appropriations, those expenses. And so for our projected fiscal year 2025 sources, we have this chart here, and there are two broad buckets of funding, either property taxes, either homestead or non-homestead, or you have your non-property taxes. So as you can see on the chart here, non-homestead education property tax is the largest single source at 39%, and that is all property that is not considered a homestead. So all the other properties are within that non-homestead classification.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
May I ask a question? Was there ever, and John, you may know the answer to this, was there ever a move or a concept to separate business from second home in the non-homestead category? Is that ever?
I'll defer to Ledge Council's knowledge on this.
So John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I don't know of any live proposals in the past that have been undertaking, but the general concept of classifications that would separate out different categories within non-homestead is very much a live thing now. And I would say that people are having those discussions. So yeah, I don't think we've had, I'm not aware of explicit language that we've had on this piece before, but certainly people are considering and in the past have thought about tackling this exact.
If I may add in a little bit more context to that, I will also add that the yield bill last year, H887, required the tax department to actually dig into, or a couple years ago, dig into this a little bit more in their reappraisal bill. So there is a report that came to the General Assembly that talked a little bit about splitting out the grand list a bit more. And there was a bill, there were a couple of bills that were floated around in the last biennium at least, that we're looking at that. But under current law, we really do just have the two categories. I will also say there's a significant challenge right now in terms of modeling, splitting out that non-homestead grand list. And that's because in statute, different grand list categories are not spelled out. So the listers are in fact assigning these different categories to different properties in the non-homestead category. However, those are not statutory definitions. So we have some inkling of what that non-homestead grand list tax base looks like, but in reality, there's a fair bit of, I guess the technical term is squish there.
That's done differently town to town, I would guess.
Yeah, exactly. So it depends on the lister, it depends on the town, and it depends on the property. So for instance, my family has a seasonal camp that my dad built a while back. It's listed as other. It could also maybe be listed as seasonal. It's got a wood fireplace, but no insulation and no running water. So does that count as residential? Would depend on the lister.
So I should have asked this, if you don't mind, going back slide or when you.
Is this the expenditures?
Yeah, when you send the December letter, you have to have some system for making assumptions as you're projecting forward from what the FY 25 and what you're projecting. How do you do that? Because we're looking at about 130 million or something. If nothing were to change from what you're projecting right now in additional ed spending this year. How did you get there? I know you went through line by line, but was it all just based on assumptions or is there more than that going on?
So, yeah, so there are some assumptions, but there's also, so we are provided data from different entities such as the Agency of Education, Department of Taxes, who we reach consensus with. So they provide us with grand list value for on the December 1 revenue side. For the expenditures, the fiscal year is not over yet, so there has to therefore be a little bit. Do you, Julia, want to go into more detail on which assumptions there are in there or not?
Sure. So the December 1 letter, it's in statute, and it spells out a list of assumptions that we need to assume in order to reach consensus, right? Because there's so much baked into the setting of property tax rates. On the expenditure side, I believe the question was FY 25, which is the current fiscal.
That's the correct, no, it's more about 26.
Forward looking.
Forward.
FY 20,
It is forward looking, so there
Yeah.
must be a lot of assumptions built into that.
certainly.
Just
So,
curious about the assumptions and how you,
so it depends on the line item.
Yeah.
The education payment, which is that aggregated education spending number. For the purpose of the December 1 letter, the Agency of Education essentially has a survey and they reach out to school districts and they say, you're currently building your budgets. At this point in time, when you haven't yet warned your budgets, what is your best estimate in terms of what the growth in your budget is going to be? Then over the course of the session, we'll have updated data coming in. So we'll really start to dial in on that ed payment line.
that's enough. That answers
Okay.
the question of large, because that's where most of the money is. So that is, okay, we'll take it into account.
So back to the education fund, so the funding side of it, so non-homestead education property tax. And then you have staying with the property tax theme, you have the net homestead education property tax. And you notice it says net there, that's because in Vermont, there is a property tax credit. So for the education fund, that's viewed as a negative revenue. And you can see that on the education fund outlook, when we get to the revenue section of that, you can see that as a negative revenue on there. And so net of your property tax credits, your homestead education property tax makes up about 26% of your ed fund sources. And then we have the non-property taxes. So the sales and use tax is a big chunk at 26% there. And that is 100% of sales and use tax, I should say. And then you have these smaller ones there, and hopefully they're a little bit legible, but thankfully you all have the printouts. So meals and rooms tax, 1/4 of that total goes to the ed fund. 1/3 of purchase and use tax goes into the ed fund, 100% of the lottery transfer. There's also, and I think the amount is too small to see on here, a Medicaid transfer, that's 100% in there. There was a one-time general fund transfer for fiscal year 25, so you can see that. And then there's a very small miscellaneous, and again, the amount is so small that the title didn't even populate on this chart. And so going back to the outlook, the ed fund outlook, we now are at the sources section, which are, you can think of that as the revenue for the statewide education fund. And so, like we mentioned, the homestead education property tax is on line 1A and the credit is line 1B. So you can see that you start off for fiscal year 25 with 762 million, but once you've removed those credits, that's how you get down to the net, which is why it's 26% instead of a higher number. And then non-homestead, you can see there on line 2. And then after line 2, you have all of your non-property taxes, your sales and use, purchase and use, meals, etc. And the total of all of those is on line 10, your total sources. And again, if
Keep going.
yeah, just if you're on your own and trying to think, oh, what goes into this exactly? The JFO website has really good annotated Ed Fund Outlook that has the descriptions that we went over under all of these lines, but
That number, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Up to you, sir.
That number for FY 25, the 2288.9 is less than the spending. Where's the rest of that come from?
oh, that's a good question, sir. So when you have a deficit, your revenue is not quite enough to cover your expenditures. Further down in the outlook and trying to zoom, well, it's not going to like if I try and zoom in on this. Well, so apologies, I was trying to give you a better view on here, but I don't think that's going to work while presenting. So when you have a deficit, you then will further down here have the allocations of revenue section. And so the prior year's surplus amount is used to help offset or net that out further down on the calculation, but also. Yep.
And that's a policy choice. So that was a policy choice that was made last year.
It's
Yeah, it does.
part of
Made.
the surplus. Yep, okay. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Thanks, sir. Does the property tax credit change year to year? And what committee does that come out? Is that out of finance typically?
So the property tax credit is set in statute and it's a calculation. And I believe I have that in here in the appendix section. So if you would like at the end, we could take a look at some of those slides, or would you like to look at?
Oh, I'll take a look myself.
Okay, yes, sir. But those are in there and they are set like there's a income tiers. So
Right.
up to
That's exactly what so the income tiers, it's not steady year to year. It is someone's pulling a lever on what that ceiling is.
So the only one that changes every year is when you no longer receive a credit. So the up to 47,000, that number is static. And then $47,001 up to 90,000, that's static. And then the part where a calculation comes in is at one point would your income be too great that you would never get a property tax credit because it's based off of your income, the difference between what you would pay on income versus what you would pay on your property. So that's the part that changes year to year, but the other tiers are set.
That's helpful. And then somewhere along the way in one of these briefings, somebody said that there was a 60% acknowledge that 60% of it's either property numbers of individual property owners are recognizing a property tax credit, or was that? Anyway, I heard 60%. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, sir, that's correct. So it's between, I would say 60 and 70%. And the Department of Taxes, they usually have those numbers on their website as well. Every year they will show the different income tiers and property tax credit averages. And so, yes, and they'll show the number of homestead property owners, because this is for homestead property tax credits for homestead, not non-homestead. And so, yes, it is 60 to 70%. And just to clarify my earlier comment, so the income tiers are static, but the actual dollar amount of the credit will change because it's based on a calculation of your property value, your income, and the tax rate as well. So that it's not just you shall get $500 if you fall into this bracket. It's income bracket, and then the calculation goes on, and then you receive a property tax credit.
And is it tiered, or like, is there a cliff, or is it a binary, yes, you get it, no, you don't? You know, is it like, you know, is it a percentage of the calculated property tax you actually pay, or is it all or nothing?
So so there is a circuit breaker below so if you have a low income below 47,000, there's a circuit breaker which says at these 3 income tiers, you shall not pay more than X percentage
Okay,
for your education or municipal property tax. And then there's also the property tax credit that's outside of that circuit breaker. And the cliffs for that are if you want to call them cliffs, are the 47,000 up to 47,000. Okay. And then $1 over that 47,000, you are then in a different calculation. And then once you're up to 90,000, and then once you're over that 90,000 number, you're in, I would say, that third tier. And then between 90,000 and an amount that's calculated every year, and it's calculated just based on at what point your income would be so high that you would not get a property tax credit. And so that's where it phases out, and that end amount has changed every year.
thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, so property taxes. So in majority of the education fund comes from either your homestead or non-homestead property tax. And so education tax rates are set to keep the ed fund balance. You know, we want to have enough to keep things funded, but also don't want to overfund it. And so the 2 tax bases, as we talked about, non-homestead and then homestead. Homestead being defined in statute as the principal dwelling and parcel of land surrounding that dwelling owned and occupied by a resident individual as the individual's domicile. And then outside of that, everything else is then considered non-homestead property. And so Vermont has a statewide education fund, but we don't have a statewide appraisal system. And so that means that we need to have a way to adjust for differing appraisal timelines. One town might have been appraised last year, one town was appraised last decade. You know, to account for that, you have the CLA, which is the common level of appraisal. And so we generally use the term equalized to refer to the tax rate if every property was appraised at the fair market value. And since that's not the reality that we are currently in, the CLA then has to happen to ensure that it's fair, there is the fair market value, and not just that your property hasn't been looked at by an appraiser or your town hasn't been looked at by an appraiser. And so we then have the non-homestead property tax, which is, as I mentioned, all real property that doesn't qualify as a homestead or isn't exempt. And so the equalized non-homestead property tax rate is uniform across towns and is not a function of your education, of your relative education spending. It's the flat statewide rate set in statute, but every year it is not withstood, which means that a different rate is set by the legislative body. And in statute, if it was not withstood, then it would default to the in statute rate. And that's not withstood during the yield bill process. Sir.
And there's no like CLA for that you have one, so we may have businesses being undertaxed or overtaxed. There's no gauge for that. No uniform,
So the CLA is applied to all properties.
all properties.
So we have a
Okay.
statewide education fund, which means that it's funded by a statewide property tax. So we have 2 classifications of
Mhm.
property, but the CLA is applied to non-homestead property tax rates as well as homestead property
thanks.
tax rates.
Going back, well, same topic, CLA. So Is the CLA unique to a town based on how long ago it had its last appraisal? Or is it a statewide number?
It's unique to a town.
Okay.
So essentially, the way to think about it is I live in Northfield. Next door is Williamstown, right? My home, if it were right to be on the border of Northfield and Williamstown, say my home is appraised this year, and my neighbor in Williamstown, their home is identical to mine, but hasn't been appraised for the past 10 years. That means that on the grand list, it's gonna look like my home is valued much higher than my neighbor's town that hasn't been appraised recently. So essentially what it does is says, okay, regardless of when Northfield and Williamstown last appraised, we're gonna bring everybody up to fair market value in order to make sure that regardless of when that appraisal schedule is shaking out across the state, everybody is paying their fair share. You did have, and this may be what you're thinking about, included in the yield bill last year, the statewide adjustment to the CLA. So basically what that did, high level, is it said, all right, on average, every community almost, maybe not every, but almost all communities are underappraised, right? Their CLA is below 100%. So the CLA is creating these significant swings in every community across the state to bring every town up to fair market value. So what the state adjustment CLA does, it says, okay, instead of benchmarking every town against 100% of fair market value, we're going to benchmark every town against the average statewide CLA. So when you're thinking of that statewide average CLA, that could be what you're thinking of the adjustment from last year, and that's around 72% for fiscal year 26.
All right, so that was non-homestead. So then you have the homestead property tax, and that is the tax on all taxable real property that qualifies as the homestead, which we had the definition is defined in statute. And so it's each town will have a different rate. So it's not uniform in the way that the non-homestead property is uniform. This is not uniform because it's dependent on the locally approved education spending. So if one town has a different decision from another town, which, that's usually how it works, your spending per pupil, if it's different, that means that those towns will have different homestead property tax rates because they elected to have different levels of per pupil spending. And so the homestead property tax then is the variable rate, whereas the non-homestead is a fixed amount.
Just a quick question. Property tax, land only, not land that has a house.
Mhm.
Land is still,
So land falls under the non-homestead property tax rate, unless, of course, you're talking about something like current use, which is a whole different subject that would be different because of the use value versus the appraised fair market value, which is what we're talking about right now, generally speaking. But yes, the non-homestead property rate is everything that is not the homestead and the land immediately surrounding that homestead as defined in the statute.
That's 2 acres. Or is that for current use? That's for current use. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the 2 acres, that's referring to the house site.
Yeah.
So for the purpose of calculating the property tax credit, you're using the house site value, which is the principal dwelling and 2 acres surrounding. For the purpose of homestead, it's the principal dwelling and all surrounding land, like part of that parcel.
What does all surrounding land mean? And by that I mean, what if it's in the middle of 100 acres? How does that work?
I'm gonna phone a friend of John.
What's the question? Sorry.
I had always thought when we talked about this, the homestead, we were talking about house and 2 acres. And I'm probably conflating that with current use. But so house and surrounding lands, how much surrounding land? Or is it just your homestead?
I
Whatever
think
you
it's all
have?
the surrounding
Whatever
lands.
you have.
So I think that Julia's explanation is
Okay.
right, that the
Okay.
2 acre
So where
context
the-
also comes up for the house site, which is to determine the PTC. There have been proposals in years past to pull that 2 acre piece into the homestead related to some of the income-based approaches.
Yeah.
So you may have seen it in that context, but the house site and homestead definitions are meaningfully different in this way, and it doesn't have 2 acre count.
Yeah, okay, yes.
So 102 acres, there's a dwelling on the 2 acres that's cut out. The other 100 acres can go into current use. So, and that rate is it's a lesser rate than the non-homestead rate. Who
So-
pays for that difference?
So for current use, there are eligibility requirements, so you would have to meet the eligibility requirement. And the property classes right now are agricultural land and then forest land, which is broken up into either managed or reserve.
Right.
And you do have to meet definitions for what is agricultural land, what is the forest land. So you do have to meet those definitions. And so for current use, when you ask who pays, can you please expand upon when you're asking about who pays? Do you mean?
Let's just say forget about the 2 acres
Mhm.
and the dwelling. That 100 acres is appraised at a discount rate.
So current use, the use value for, let's just say it's a farm, 100 acre farmland, and you did qualify for the current use program. So I know this number because I just did a presentation for ag on this, and I believe it's 400 for 2024. It was $483 per acre for agricultural land. And so what happens is that is the use value for this qualifying current use parcel per acre. And so that amount is the amount that you would pay that, but you're still paying the same non-homestead property tax rate. It's just the value of the land is now $483 per acre versus what the fair market value of that land would be. So you're still paying the same education tax rate that everyone else in the state is. It's just the value of your land has been reduced to meet the current uses set value, and that's adjusted every year by the board. Does that answer your question, sir?
No, so if you've got 100 acres that's not in current use,
Mhm.
they're gonna get taxed more than property that is in current use.
Yes.
Because their land is assessed at a higher value, then yes, the total dollars that they pay would be different, but they are both paying the same non-homestead property tax rate. It's just the function difference is that one is valued at the fair market value. And if this is what you're getting at, perhaps, is that yes, like that does reduce the amount of tax revenues going into the education fund.
Right.
And if you care to look, I have.
So who pays for that?
So.
Is it the balance of the other property owners?
So since this is a statewide system, yes, any reduction in funds would therefore be made up by the system as a whole, since we do have a statewide system for the education payment. When it comes to municipal payments, it's different, but for education, yes, the whole system therefore absorbs the difference.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, so so we've talked about property taxes, non-homestead and homestead. So then we get to the next piece of the puzzle, which is pupil weights and long-term weighted average daily membership. And the reason that this is important is because we want the spend per pupil is what determines your tax rate. And so by having weights for your pupils, that determines, what your spend per pupil is. And so the weights are in statute and are used to address the student counts and different needs or circumstances. So as you can see here, just as an example, the economically deprived background weight is 1.03, and which is different from English language learner weight, which is 2.49, and those weights are recognizing that there's a different cost associated with students in different circumstances. And so after the long-term daily average membership, which is ADM, LT ADM, is reported, you then apply weights based on the types of students to account for those potentially higher costs associated with either different grades or different backgrounds, like the economic or English language learner that I referenced earlier. So the weights are then added to your long-term ADM, and then that's how you reach your long-term weighted ADM.
So that weight is just the percentage, basic. Is that correct? That goes on to, when we were talking about this earlier and they were saying an added weight. So 13,200 is what they think they came up for foundation. Then is this 0.36 a percentage of that 13,000, or what is that? What's weight mean?
Sure. So for our the current system, and these are weights from the current system. These are tax capacity rather than functioning off of a base amount. So these aren't designed to add from a 13,200 as you just mentioned. This is reducing. So this is changing the amount spent per student, which is keeping your amount spent per student lower, which reduces the tax rate. So if you have 100 students versus 200 students, but you're spending the same amount total, the amount spent per student is then different. So the weights allow more to be there in a way spent without your relative tax rate going up by that same amount. Julie, do you want to elaborate on any of that, or?
Sure. Everything Ezra has said is absolutely correct.
But, yeah.
I think that the way that's helpful to think about it, in terms of thinking about tax capacity weights, is that they had the weights adjust how much a school district can have in its education spending for a certain tax rate, right? So if a school district, as Ezra mentioned, has more weighted pupils, then they can spend more in education spending for a certain tax rate than a school district with fewer weighted pupils, because we're doing that per pupil calculation. And the reason that we keep referencing per pupil and per weighted pupil is because you'll think about the wide variance of school districts across the state. It's really hard to compare really big school district with a lot of students to a really small school district with a few number of students. There's no apples to apples of just looking at their budgets, right? Because they're providing all sorts of different kinds of services and education to different student bodies. So the purpose of the weights and student counts and doing a per weighted pupil spending amount is to get the apples to apples comparison.
And just to reiterate, this is not based off of even if there's no implied base that these are necessarily running off of, because it's tax capacity rather than there being some underlying base, just to reiterate that point.
Because the newer system has an underlying rate.
Exactly. And I'm sure that, having these back to back we're both using weights, but using it in a different way can certainly be confusing between the two. But yeah, these are for tax capacity rather than multiplying to a base dollar amount, which is what the weights that were presented earlier are doing. So we talk about all of that, all of these weightings, because as Julie just mentioned, homestead property tax is based on, as you see highlighted there in green, the per pupil education spending. That's why you weight the pupils who have higher needs. So in statute, the homestead property tax rate is $1 per 100 of property value and is then adjusted by your local per pupil education spending. I will note that you can't go below $1. That is the floor. So you can't spend too little and then have below $1. So that is the floor for that. And then it's adjusted by your locally approved per pupil spending because the locally approved budgets in Vermont, but then because you're approving those budgets, you are then getting some of that, the locally approved budgets weight. And so you have the formula up there. So the equalized homestead property tax rate is your per pupil education spending. Should have remembered my water bottle, but so, and that is your education spending, if you can see in that other little box up there, divided by your long-term weighted average daily membership, which is the definition or the weights we just took a look at. So that's why those weights are important here, because all else being equal, more weighted pupils allows you to spend more and maintain the same rate, or spend the same as a neighboring district, but have a lower relative. And then that's divided by the property yield multiplied by that $1 floor set in statute there. And that's how the district gets their tax rate for their homestead property tax. And so we talked about property tax credit. And so here we are. So homestead property tax credit is based on income. And as I mentioned, you have these different brackets or tiers here. So the less than or equal to 47,000 in household income, the $47,001 to 90,000 bracket, and then $90,001 up to this year. And this is the part that I had mentioned does change. 115,000 in prior years, that amount is different. And that's because this is calculated annually. This is the income where you would not pay less if you were paying on income versus paying on your property value. So that is that 115 does change from year to year, but the others are the, I guess you'd say, the fixed tiers of income. So about 70% of Vermont households do receive property tax credit on their homestead property tax. And there is a lag in the system. So you actually, if you qualify this year, you don't get that until your following year's tax bill. And so each income tier has a different credit parameter. So you can see on the $47,001, it's property tax credit may be used on the first 400,000 of your house site value. But then if you're at that $90,001 income tier, it gets changed to the first 225,000 of your house site value. And so that's part of the calculation as well. You know, depending on your property's value, even if you have the same income as someone, your credits will be different because of that. So that's why, you know, it does change, and it's not just an easy, like, yes, you will get $500 if you fall into this income bracket. And so that was the last topic for our high level overview. Some resources here from Joint Fiscal Office and some of the other agencies and departments as well who work on in this area. So any further questions?
That always.
If I could, I'm trying to now kind of connect the last brief to this brief, taking the suggested weights for student needs from the last brief to your slide 17. Just make a kind of a parallel between the two. Essential early education stays at the same amount, but we subtract the four-year-olds. That way, four-year-olds bump up into the next category.
So if I may jump in here, I do want to caution the direct weight in the prior presentation to the weights presented here, because they're applied in completely different manners, right?
What Senator Hardy was getting at.
So the weights that we're seeing here are really tax capacity weights. They're not determining funding levels. Whereas the weights that were presented to you earlier from the administration, I'm not ready to comment one way or another. on them, I will just point out just the actual mechanism of the way that they work. Is there essentially a ratio being applied to a base amount, right? So you've got your base amount, you apply the weight, it's X number of more dollars. Whereas what we're showing here are fitting into our tax rate calculation.
And in the back, kind of breaks that down if you, in your appendix.
I will also say, I don't actually know if it was last year or the year before that, but I did publish an issue brief about the pupil weights in Vermont's education finance system. And it spells out, what does tax capacity mean and how do pupil weights work in our funding formula? So I'd be happy to forward that to the committee to understand some of that more written intuition.
And this is what they were saying, that it is so complex that it's hard to make sense of it. If, for the layman.
Further question from the committee?
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you all. Very helpful.
Yes, it was.
That's helpful.
Yes, on that last comment about the summary you had on tax capacity.
Yeah,
I'll send that to Will and have him send it to the committee.
Obviously, I missed
we got
day in school.
I honestly don't know if I ever presented it to the committee. I think
you did
maybe,
years ago.
Oh, yes, we are adjourned.